leaving that, one thing I left out about the last chapter, I think I mentioned in connection with the chapter on Islam, chapter 7. But a lot of times Islamic nations, when they conquer a place, they impose a tax on non-Islamic people called a jizya. The jizya was a tax that Islamic people did not pay, a special tax, but the non-Islamic people did. And part of the purpose of the tax was to help make sure that Islamic people had an economic advantage over non-Islamic people. They imposed this throughout the Middle East, at times in North Africa, and as far as away as Pakistan and India. So it does apply to what I said about India, because Islam conquered most of northern India, Pakistan, Nepal. What is today Pakistan, what is today Nepal, and what is today Bangladesh. All are Muslim countries today. And some of them from time to time had this tax imposed on them. The tax was not imposed on by all Islamic conquerors and not imposed on every generation. It was something that they did sometimes and sometimes they didn't. All right, moving back on to China. I started with China last time and mentioned that after the Han Dynasty fell, China went through a period of chaos. The Mongolians came down and they took over much of northern China. Southern China was still ruled by the Chinese, but they were not united. They had what's called the era of 6 dynasties. Well, this chaos was to last about 400 years and was to end when the Sui, now this word according to your book is pronounced Sui. The Sui dynasty united China. Now there are 4 dynasties that we'll be talking about. I've listed them here on the board. The Sui united China, the Tang dynasty, I'm not sure of the pronunciation of that word, but I will call it the Tang dynasty. Under them, China reached, to some people say, its greatest extent in their literature, their economic achievement, and a lot of times in years to come, in years that followed, the Chinese looked back on this great dynasty that, hey, under them, we had Mongolia. They conquered Korea and put Korea to tribute. Now, China was never able to conquer Japan. And in the next chapter, when we talk about Japan, we must remember that Japan was never defeated until the United States defeated them in the 20th century. But Japan was an island off the coast of China, and China tried to conquer Japan a few times and always failed. Anyway, the Tang dynasty lasted for several generations. I don't know how many. But they eventually became corrupt. And their corruption encouraged rebellion. Eventually some villain rebelled and actually conquered the capital for a while. But the Chinese people rose up against the villain. I'm not going to name the villain. I mean, his name's in the book, and he goes down in Chinese history as one of the most notoriously bad men who ever lived in China. But anyway, he was defeated. The Tang dynasty never recovered. And eventually they were overthrown. The Mongolians came down and bothered the Chinese for a while, and China went through a couple of generations of chaos. Not as long as they had before. In other words, if you study the history, it's a history of up and down, cyclical periods of chaos, followed by a strong dynasty, followed by a period of chaos, followed by a strong dynasty. The next dynasty I find most interesting, the Sung dynasty, brought some kind of order. Now, I have personally called the Sung dynasty a socialistic dynasty. Their rulers did more to help the poor than anyone else, than any of these dynasties. But maybe it wasn't their own fault, but from the beginning they were plagued by foreign invasions. Tibet revolted, and China could not hold Tibet, so they lost Tibet. Korea revolted, China again could not hold Korea, they lost Korea. Now, I personally have not studied it extensively enough to know what made the Song so vulnerable to military reverses, but I think a lot of it was a problem that I'm going to use the word liberal, I'm going to use the word socialist, that a lot of times liberal socialistic people have is they fail to realize that to be strong you have to maintain a strong army. The Song dynasty, they were great at helping the poor, they were great at fostering the arts, great at fostering literature, great at encouraging philosophy, and very poor in mounting a military because maybe they didn't see the need to. But China's army became very weak under them. And eventually, they were conquered then by the Mongolians, led by a man named Genghis Khan. Whom I have mentioned before and will be mentioned, of course, now. Anyway, the Sung dynasty was a dynasty in power. And I remember when I was 11 years old checking out a book on Genghis Khan. Then when I was in graduate school, I checked out the same book from the University of Tennessee Library and read it again. I couldn't help but get the feeling that Genghis Khan, with his army of 100,000 men, should never have been able to conquer China with its millions of people. But again, folks, this is what happens when you have an attitude of all the army is just a bunch of killers and we don't need them. We can have peace through negotiations. So they don't fight, or when they do fight, they don't fight effectively. And the result was the Sung dynasty succumbed to Genghis Khan, and the Mongol dynasty, or the Yuan, took over. The most famous Yuan leader was Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is remembered for two things. Number one, he tried to conquer Japan. He sent a very large navy to Japan, the largest that had ever been sent by the Chinese against Japan. But a kamikaze came up. Now, we're going to run into that word kamikaze again later. Anybody know where? World War II. In World War II, the Japanese suicide fighters were called kamikaze. Well, the Japanese called it divine wind. A strong wind came up and destroyed the Chinese fleet. Now, the same thing was to happen in England. In fact, a lot of people compare British history to Japanese. In 1588, the Spanish sent a big fleet of ships to conquer England, and a big wind came up, a gale came up, and destroyed the Spanish fleet, the Armada. And Spain has not recovered from that to this day. Spain's Armada was destroyed and England remained independent. Same thing happened, something similar happened in Japan. A divine wind came up, called a kamikaze, and the Japanese were unconquered. Then Kublai Khan is remembered for something else by us, we Westerners. He was the emperor when Marco Polo visited. In the 1300s, Marco Polo was an Italian who visited China, became an official in Kublai Khan's court, then came back to Italy and wrote a book about his travels. His book was read by Christopher Columbus, who decided, hey, I'm going to try to reach China by sailing west instead of going around Africa. Columbus never reached China. But Kublai Khan was the emperor that impressed Marco Polo, and In fact, Kublai Khan liked Marco Polo so well, he tried to encourage Marco Polo not to leave, but Marco Polo decided it was time for him to go back home. All right, now while these dynasties were switching back and forth, other things were happening in China. One of them is the civil service exam. With the civil service exam, China was way ahead of its time. It wasn't until the 1800s that Europeans got the idea. And in the United States, we still have a civil service exam that somewhat determines a person's fitness for a government job. But the Chinese decided rather than give government jobs to the sons of the man who had them, because oftentimes the son was incompetent, they would determine who was fit for office by giving him a test. And if you did well on a test, you were fit for office. Now, there were several problems with it, your book mentions, but nevertheless, the idea was there that if you did well on the big test, you were probably qualified to hold a government office. Problem number one was there were no public schools, so your average Chinese person was not educated, which meant that only the rich could afford to educate their children, so only the rich could take the exam. There were a few exceptions, a few persons whom a local magistrate might see what he thought was a really bright young boy and take him into his home and educate him. A few persons who were from poor families might have risen up that way and taken the exam and passed it. But for the most part, only the rich could take the exam. It is known, like anything else, there was cheating on the exams. And cheating on tests has made big news here in our country. I mean, mankind has not improved morally from time past. You can argue that if you want to. I won't argue with you, but I'll let you stay. But mankind's morals, if anything, are getting worse as time goes on, not better. But it's known that there was cheating on the exam. There was another problem with the exam. Now, folks, it's been, let's see, I believe the year was about 2004. I said what I'm about to say now, and someone went straight to the department head's office and told on me. The department's head sent me a letter, why was I saying something like this, and I answered back, if he wanted to say something, he could have spoken up in class. He didn't have to come to you. And I said, the grades in my class anyway are determined by your test scores and not by whether or not you agree with me. He could disagree with me all he wanted to. You can too. All right, here's what I said. The book says that the civil service exams were slanted toward Confucius. Well, that's not so bad. Then I said, today our advanced tests to get high up in college are slanted toward the left. Liberalism and socialism. Now, I discussed this recently with a faculty member who says it's still true. It was true when I was a youngster. Take that. I'm talking about the national teacher exam and the graduate record exam and possibly the ACT and GRE tests. Well, less so those. I mean, but basically they're slanted towards the left. And if you're not sure about which choice to pick, a lot of times you pick the most leftist, liberal answer you can. That's the one they want. All right. Now, again, if any of you want to say anything against what I said, you're welcome to speak up now. I mean, you'll find this to be true if you get higher up in your education system and start taking some of these exams to get into graduate school. They're slanted, folk. I'm not the only person who thinks so. Anyway, back to the time period we're talking about. The Chinese civil service exams were slanted towards Confucius. At times, Buddhist questions got in there also, but mainly it was slanted towards Confucius to try to encourage that only Confucian people could pass. In fact, in order to pass, you had to memorize very large portions of Confucius's writings. Again, this much is in the book. To help to guarantee that only Confucian men would would get to pass the exam. Now, you may have noticed I've said men when talking about the exams. Only men were allowed to take them. Again, this much is in the book also. Now, the idea of the civil service exam was taken up by the Koreans, the Vietnamese for a while, and the Japanese. But again, they seem to have gotten the idea from the Chinese. The village continued to be the lowest level of Japanese. The lowest level of Chinese government. Their government started with a village. You had a local village surrounded by a farm. Then a few miles away, you'd have another village surrounded by a bunch of farmland. And a lot of times the emperors left the local village alone as long as there was peace and quiet. He didn't care how the local village governed itself. The economy consisted mostly of farming. The main crop, of course, was rice. But there was some beginnings of a merchant class. Merchants began to sell their wares, and there was some beginnings of manufacturing. But now I want to jump ahead and say that eventually the merchant class was suppressed, manufacturing was discouraged. And folk, a point I want to make, and I'll be repeating this before the class is over. The Chinese are the people who almost became the most inventive and creative people on the face of the globe, but they didn't. Along the way, they fell by the wayside, and your book will, and a lot of people have wondered why, where did they go wrong? But for a while, they were leading humanity. They had far more gold than Europe did, and they made a lot of inventions that should have propelled them to the top of the world, but they fell by the wayside. The Chinese, your book starts to mention on page 276 and 277 some of the things they invented. 276, they invented the blast furnace that could help to convert wrought iron into steel. And with some steel, they could make swords, sickles, even suits of armor. Now, the first steel mills, they were the first cotton growers we know of. They invented gunpowder. They invented the flamethrower. We'll go on. They invented paper money. And you may not realize how important this is, folks. Without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. You simply can't, as long as money consists of nothing but gold and silver. Along with paper money, they invented the banking system. And again, without banks, you cannot have a smooth flow of money. I want to give you some example of what life might be without banks. I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and supposing Lockheed had only been able to pay us in gold and silver coins when they sold an airplane. Well, there were times when I was at Lockheed when the company didn't sell airplanes for months. So what this would mean was that we might work for several months without getting paid, and all of a sudden the company had sold 4 airplanes. Hey, we all get paid. So we all get our back pay, a big pocket, or maybe a wheelbarrow full or a bucket full of silver and gold coins. And in addition to the big risk of having us being robbed on our way home, there'd be, just now we have to count our coins and decide what to do with them, and then start paying all of our back utilities and back house payments and all this stuff. The result would be economic chaos, pure and simple. As it was, Lockheed had accounts with the local banks. So we got our weekly paycheck, and every week Lockheed would pump several $1 million into the local economy. That would even affect us here. And they hired a bunch of people from as far away as Calhoun and Adairsville, and it would help their economy also. They pumped thousands of dollars into the economies of various places around the area every week, every Friday. And that meant that there was an even, steady, smooth flow of money. And eventually Lockheed would get its money when it sold the planes and pay the bank back. But again, most of you will probably not be able to buy a car or a house without taking out some kind of a loan. And yes, even men like Ted Turner sometimes takes out loans. Even your biggest tycoons will sometimes borrow money. Donald Trump, about 30 years ago, they told us Donald Trump's net worth was zero. By net worth, that means he had millions of dollars worth of assets, but an equal amount of liabilities, so net, he had zero. That didn't last long, by the way, but I mean, hey, about borrowing money, a lot of experts will say if you have a choice between spending your money or spending someone else's money to buy a car, you're better off borrowing the money and spending someone else's money rather than spending yours, and taking your money and investing it in the hopes that the money you invest will bring more return than the interest you would pay on the car loan. If you follow the logic. Now, let me tell you a horror story. I mean, I knew a woman back in 1985 who was determined that she was not ever going to go into debt. So she saved up all this money and drove a junk car, but she saved up money to buy a new car. Then she went to a dealership after she saved up $10,000 and bought a $10,000 car, but she didn't have enough money to insure the thing. She did buy liability insurance, had an accident shortly afterward that was her fault, left her in pain for as far as I know the rest of her life. And the insurance company paid for the other person's car. Total loss. Now, what if she had put down about $5,000 on that car and invested the other $5,000 in a mutual fund? Today, that $5,000 might be worth $30,000 or $40,000. And folk don't ever drive a new car without full. Now, the old cars, it's okay to, let the full coverage lapse, just have liability, that's required by law. But for a new car, you don't want to go without full coverage on it. Anyway, just something I thought I'd throw in. Again, she'd have been better off if she simply had borrowed most of the money, made a down payment, bought the insurance, otherwise borrowed most of the money and invested the rest. And again, a lot of experts will tell you that's the way now. If you've heard otherwise or disagree with that, your input is welcome. But the Chinese had the same concepts: banking, paper money, the beginnings of industry, commerce, trade, making of steel, making of gunpowder. Then to facilitate trade, now trade over the Silk Road was dangerous. I've mentioned the Silk Road. Travel over the mountains was really difficult. Anyway, and also there were bandits all side. So they built huge, huge ships. And it's believed that some of their ships were 450 feet long, the biggest wooden vessels ever built. Except the Greeks are known to build one that was 450 foot long, but the 450 foot is about as long. And now, how did they build them? Well, it's believed that they would take teak wood, was their favorite wood for shipbuilding, and bury the teak wood underground for several years, and then dig the teak wood back up. I mean, they cover it over in a casket, like, bury it for somebody, and then dig it back up, and it'd be really, really, really hard wood. And then from this hard wood, they could build very large ships. And these ships are known to have gone to Africa, gone to India, and of course to Japan, but also they are known to have gone to California. Now, the Chinese had little interest in staying in California, but they got to California long before Columbus got to the West Indies. Now, keep in mind, though, the distance from Europe to the Americas is only about 4,000 miles. The distance from China to California is about 10,000 miles. So the Chinese had farther to travel. Nevertheless, the Chinese lost interest in their shipbuilding, and finally one of the emperors allowed their ships to rot. Today, all we have of their big ships is nothing more than one rudder, but the rudder is big enough for 450-foot vessels, so it leads us to believe they actually did build them. But anyway, they started to build, folk, and they were on their way to the top. They were on their way to becoming the most advanced people on the face of the earth, but they simply fell by the wayside. Now, your book mentions that These Chinese ships are known to have been able to carry several hundred men and had 4 masts. But they allowed them all to rot. And in the long run, they did the Chinese little good. The book mentions, and folks, this is something that I ran into when I was in graduate school, and I missed it. Maybe I missed it on a test. And maybe that's one reason you'll always remember, because they say you'll remember what you missed more than you remember what you got right. In China, a new group of people came in, the new landed gentry who owned the land. Now, the difference between the gentry and the nobility, they have a hereditary title. They pass the title from father to son and from son all the way down. That's nobility. It's also royalty. Landed gentry are people who acquired their wealth by their own abilities. And then they did not necessarily pass it on to their sons. But eventually, a few people owned all the land. And your ordinary farmer then was reduced to serfdom or to peasantry. Now, basically, that word peasant, you'll run into it from time to time. It means a poor farmer who is too poor to buy the land he has to farm. So he farms on somebody else's land and gives the better part of his produce to the landlord. There are other definitions of that word, but this is a definition that I'll use for right now. And again, you run into it from time to time throughout your study of history. Now, women. In China, under the Tang dynasty, as in most dynasties in China until recently, the women were looked on as being inferior to men. Their position was one of servitude. And this was to remain true until perhaps the 20th century. Particularly, this was expressed by the Chinese practice of foot binding. Now, foot binding, I want to state right off the bat, has been outlawed. Your authors say that when they visited China in the 1980s, they still saw some women who had their feet bound. There were attempts to outlaw foot binding in the 1880s when China had a female ruler, an empress. Finally, the communists outlawed it when they took over. They took over in 1949, and I believe they outlawed it practically in 1950. All right, but essentially, here's what foot binding was. They would take young girls, infants, from the time they were born, and put their feet in a shoe that was guaranteed to not allow their feet to grow. So their feet remained infant size all the way throughout their lives. The purpose of it, supposed the purpose was to make the Chinese more attractive to men by changing the shape of their legs to where the Chinese women then would look more attractive to men. And also the purpose was to keep the Chinese women subservient. In other words, to where they could more easily be controlled by men. Now, I had a young man in one of my classes in another school said, "I don't find crippled women attractive." I said, "I don't either. American men generally don't. But if you had been a Chinese man living in the 13, 14, 15, 16, and 1700s, you might have found this attractive." Now, when the Chinese communists outlawed foot binding, there was a lot of opposition, and folk, believe it or not, it actually came from the women, because a lot of Chinese women said, "Hey, young girls should have their feet bound. It's the way that heaven intended it, or the way that it should be done." The nearest practice we have in the West that corresponds to foot binding is the practice of women wearing high heels. Now, I don't see that as much now as I once did. High heels would much too often lead to horns, bunions, ingrown toenails, fallen arches, plantar warts, to where when I was a kid, 90 to 95% of women had foot problems. I mean, in some cases, serious foot problems. And the Army would turn away a high percentage of men also, because even some of the men would wear their shoes too tight, or wear the same shoes too long while they were growing up, and it would restrict the growth of their feet. and the army would turn away men who had defective feet because of the long marches, flat-footed in particular. Even though flat-footedness is not something you bring on yourself. All right, but anyway, foot binding was a practice that was done and done for centuries in China. Again, a lot of women felt like they could never attract a man unless their feet were bound. Genghis Khan. Of all the world's great empire builders, there are only two who actually you can say started out in poverty. I mean, Julius Caesar was born to a very high noble family in Rome, one of Rome's top families, and Alexander the Great was a son of the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean region. You can't say they started off in poverty. Anyway, Genghis Khan started off, his father was a nobleman, and when Genghis Khan was 10 years old, his father was poisoned, and all of Genghis's father's tribe left him except for a few women. So Genghis, from the time he was 10 to the time he was 18 or so, led a bunch of women around. But then when he grew up, he was able to take a long story short, he was able to conquer and unite all of Mongolia. Now, when he was a kid, the Mongolians were a bunch of small, loose tribes fighting each other, spending more time fighting each other than they were fighting anyone else, and they're just roaming around somewhat aimlessly, purposelessly. But anyway, he united all the Mongolians and organized an army into a formidable army. And one of the things he did that made his army so formidable, he organized his army into squads of 10 and said any man who leaves his squad of 10 during a battle will be put to death. So in other words, basically, you could not fight a Mongolian without fighting all 10 of the whole squad. You couldn't fight one individually in the squad. And this was a very effective means of fighting, by the way. Anyway, he then set his sights on China. He was reluctant at first because he knew that China had millions of people, but he had advisors who convinced him that, hey, the Chinese army under the Sung dynasty is very, very weak and ineffective. The Tibetans have beaten them, the Koreans have beaten them, and we think you can too. So he went to the Great Wall of China with his men, and of course the Chinese were terrified. But he just simply marched up and down the wall several times, and after a while the Chinese became complacent. I mean, the Chinese weren't going to spend a lot of money on military anyway. And Genghis Khan noticed, hey, they're not protecting the wall as much as they did. They sent a bunch of the troops home who were protecting the wall. So one day he noticed that a certain gate didn't have very many men protecting it, so he had his men just get a battering ram and bam, rammed the gate open, and he got inside the wall, he and his entire army. Then once inside, there was no stopping him. Even the emperor was terrified. Everybody ran and fled. The general committed suicide by poisoning himself. And nobody stood up against him and fought. Now, I had a Mongolian student argue that Genghis Khan was so great that he would have defeated any Chinese commander. My take on that is that no matter how great a general he was or how great a military leader, every person has limitations and every person can be defeated. If the Chinese would have been strong and stood up to him, they outnumbered him about 10 to 1, but they were simply terrified. What they should have done was trained a bunch of their men in fighting his type of tactics and fighting the way he fought, trained them. Also, the Chinese initially used gunpowder against him, but then eventually he caught on to how great a weapon gunpowder was, and he started using gunpowder himself. The Chinese invented the gunpowder, taught its use to the Mongolians. Then the Mongolians came in and used it against the Chinese. Genghis Khan did not actually conquer all of China. China was huge. Genghis Khan, though, did conquer the northern part of China and destroyed the Sung dynasty and placed the Yuan dynasty in its place. Genghis Khan, though, went on to cross the Himalayan mountains and go in and threaten the Islamic world. He destroyed city after city in a bloodthirsty, just for the sheer sake of killing. some of his Mongolian hordes went through Russia and conquered Russia, and the Mongolians were to rule Russia for 200 years. That we'll talk about later, but keep that in mind. I don't want to forget it. The Mongolians held Russia, but the Mongolians then went on into Poland and fought a Polish army. But then Genghis Khan, they got news that Genghis Khan had died, so the Mongolians were all called home to settle affairs at home. What would have happened to Europe if Genghis Khan could have lived longer? Big question. I had a Russian student back around 2002 ask me, what's the biggest contribution the Russians have made? I said, okay, I'll tell you. There were three things. Contribution number one was they defeated Hitler, and I mean it as a compliment. They defeated Hitler. Contribution number two, they defeated Napoleon. But contribution number three, they served as a buffer between Mongolia and Western Europe. And if you look on the map, Russia is a huge buffer. What would have happened? Now, again, if the Mongolians had gone on into Europe, they might have created havoc because Europe was in a state of disunity at the time. Now, something else that they did, when the Mongolians, though, came across, unknown to them, following them, was a black rat that was carrying a flea. The black rat was carrying the flea that carried the plague, the Black Death germ. Again, even the Mongolians did not know that. And the Black Death was to hit Europe really hard and hit China. And I had the students, what was the Black Death? Well, essentially it was a disease that carried away 1/3 of the population of Europe in the 1300s, and was to last for some 400 years. 13, 14, 15, 16. By 1750, it was part of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague finally disappeared from Europe. But it was to plague Europe for 400 years. What caused it? Oh yes, there was a germ. But what made Europeans susceptible to it? Again, folk, it looks like it was a climate change. How come Europeans overcame it? Beginning in the 1700s, the climate started warming up. And Europeans developed resistance to it. So did the Chinese. And the bubonic plague largely disappeared from the world when humans began to become resistant to it, thanks to a warming, at least a warming of the northern hemisphere, and possibly a global warming also. Now, the Mongolians, they began to assert themselves once they'd taken over. They eventually, the Genghis Khan himself didn't, but eventually Mongolia conquered all of China. Then they went in and they conquered Korea. Now in Vietnam, now the next chapter when we talk about Vietnam, when the Mongolians went to Vietnam, they had a problem. The Mongolians, like the Muslims, were used to fighting in a wide open plain on horseback. They went to the jungles of Vietnam, and that kind of fighting was not very effective at all. And to make a long story short, they temporarily conquered the Vietnamese because they outnumbered them. But the Vietnamese counterattacked using guerrilla warfare. And the Vietnamese were able to send the Mongolians home in defeat. If you think that sounds familiar, Vietnam was to do the same thing to the United States many, many generations later. Again, the jungles of Vietnam are just ideally conducive to guerrilla type warfare. The Mongolians couldn't fight it, couldn't fight that way. And it turns out the United States found it a very ineffective way of fighting also. All right. Under the Mongolians, the religion of Confucius was largely restored. And that will take us up to the another conflict we'll talk about at the end of the chapter. We're about to talk about it now. Anyway, the Mongolian dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, eventually gave rise to the Ming. Your book goes on in detail to talk more about the Mongolians. The Ming dynasty was destined to rule until until about the late 1800s. They were the last of China's great dynasties. All right. Now, while all this was going on politically, I'm not going to get into the main. To me, that's a subject for a later chapter. While all this was going on, there was also another conflict going on. Your book calls it In Search of the Way, or a conflict between religion and philosophy. Throughout most of its history, China's main religion has been Confucianism. However, Buddhism and Taoism, they made inroads during much of the time period we're talking about. And for a while it looked like these two religions might take over. Now, as was happening in India, when India was threatened by Buddhism, China was also threatened by Buddhism and Taoism, both of which appeared to be more spiritual than Confucianism. Well, it looked for a while like these two more spiritual religions might win. Now, Buddhism had a problem. It was a foreign religion, and the Chinese have resisted foreign religions. Now, folk, I'm going to throw something in that your book doesn't mention, will eventually mention later. Christianity is believed to have arrived in China around the year 100 CE or 100 AD or 100 in a common era, depending on how you term it. And waves and waves of Christian missionaries came into China all down through the centuries. But they made few converts, again, possibly because Buddhism appeared to be a foreign religion, Christianity even more so, because Christianity seemed to be a religion for the far, far away Mediterranean, whom the Chinese people looked down on, not realizing it was going to be these people from the far, far away Western Europe who would eventually come in and almost conquer them. But anyway, Christianity was there, but it was a very, very minor religion at the time. The main ones, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And they made a lot of headway. Eventually, though, Confucius reformed into what you call Neo-Confucianism came along the scene, but it never did become the official religion of China. Kublai Khan himself was a Buddhist, but under him, China did not convert to Buddhism. But he remained Buddhist even after he had conquered all of China. But now, there were two main philosophers, and they argued about, what was important and what wasn't. If I can find their names. One of them was Yang Wangmang, and the other one, Zhu Xi. Okay, yeah. Essentially, here's what they argued over. I'm not going to write their names down. I mean, they won't be on the test. But essentially, they would argue over what relation does the material have to the spirit world. And one of these philosophers argued that every item in the universe had a connection somehow to the spirit world. And every person had a connection to the spirit world. And the human beings had a halfway intermediate between the spirit world on the one hand, the material world on the other. And while we could see and feel the material world, we also must get in touch with the spiritual world. But then along came another group of philosophers who said, no, the real issue is not getting in touch with the material or the spiritual world. The real issue is the understanding of self. They would argue over whether or not they should investigate things, and a lot of them believed that the real way to find true meaning of life was to investigate things. And one philosopher, Yang Wangmang, believed that we should investigate the outside world. But again, you might think, well, wouldn't this have led to scientific achievement? Seems like it would, but in the case of the Chinese folk, it simply didn't. Now, some of the issues that they raised, and I'll tell you what, I got here to school really early this morning, and I began studying these philosophies myself. Some of the issues that they raised are issues that we simply cannot answer. What is important, the study of the self or the study of the world around us? I mean, hey, to me, it's an academic question. They're both important in their own way. But now, here's what the practical application of these arguments had. The Chinese spent their time arguing among themselves over the existence of the soul, the existence of heaven, whether or not our ancestors were to be worshipped, and some of them believed in ancestor worship, and one of them said, well, no, our ancestors didn't have a soul, therefore they died, they no longer exist, but I'm going to worship them anyway, just by way of honoring them, honoring their memory, even though I know they can't hear me because they don't exist. But here's the bottom line. China simply fell behind the West. Now, while China was busy investigating the nature of heaven, whether heaven existed, the nature of whether or not the soul existed, whether or not we should investigate ourselves, whether or not we should investigate the world around us. While China was doing this, Europeans were developing a merchant class. Europeans were inventing the mechanical clock. And folk, if you know anything about the mechanical clock that Europeans invented, it ultimately was to lead to the invention of the automobile and the airplane. A mechanical clock has gears that are set to a ratio of 60 to 1. The second hand moves 60 times faster than the minute hand, and a minute hand moves 60 times around for every 12 times that the hour hand moves around. Actually, no, the minute hand moves 60 times faster than the hour hand. The hour hand moves then 12 times a day. I mean, if you follow the logic of the clock. But they had to gear these things down, and they would put these clocks on a pendulum, and the pendulum then, of course, if you know anything about a pendulum eventually stops motion unless you have some devices to keep it in motion, to keep kicking. So they put what we call pine. Are you familiar with the cuckoo clock with its pine cones? You set the pine cones at the top, and then 24 hours later you have to raise the pine cones back up. The pine cones provided the weight. They kept the pendulum in motion. Now, yeah, my parents had 2 cuckoo clocks when I was growing up, and I would spend my time trying to get them to keep time with the electric clocks we had in the house. Of course, the electric clocks were set by a scientist who made sure that that the alternating current was alternating exactly 60 cycles a second, and that kept the electric clocks on the right time. Well, think about the pendulum clock. If it was moving too fast, well, move the pendulum down a little bit. That would slow it down. Then it would always move too slow. The fact of the matter is, try as I might, you could never get them to keep the right time. They gain as much as a minute or 2 every day. Any of you now know what I'm talking about? None of you have tried to synchronize a pendulum clock with electric clocks. I did when I was a kid, and I learned you can't quite do it. But anyway, Europeans invented these mechanical devices, and again, the gears that they invented were eventually to lead to the invention of the automobile, the airplane. In addition, Europeans invented the telescope, the microscope, lenses, spectacles. In fact, there was a spectacle maker who invented the telescope. And all these inventions that Europeans made while the Chinese were sitting there busy debating over moral philosophy. And the result was that China, which had been far ahead of the Europeans in science and knowledge, stayed stagnant and fell behind and fell farther and farther behind, and would remain behind until recent times. Now, let me hasten to state now, here in the 21st century, the Chinese have a space program going, and a lot of persons say if the United States is not careful, the Chinese are going to beat us back to the moon. They're going to go there, and not like what we did, they're going to go there and stay, set up colonies, and the first colonies on the moon might very well be Chinese. They have put their men into orbit, and I believe some of their women also. But anyway, so they might not remain behind. In fact, somebody said that the pendulum, and I'm back to word pendulum, between west and east shifts every 500 years. 500 years ago, the pendulum was in favor of China. Most of the last 500 years, the pendulum has been in favor of the West, but the pendulum might be swinging back towards China again as the West appears to be declining. Again, you might not think so, you might not see it, but a lot of persons see it. The West is declining. The Chinese might just forge ahead. All right. Anyway, your book goes on to describe Chinese literature, and among other things that the Chinese invented was the novel. Oh yes, the most important invention perhaps that ever made, and this was the invention, folks, that should have propelled them to the top of humanity, but the invention was a printing press. Without a printing press, you cannot have novels. And Europeans did not start writing novels until they invented a press. I mean, you know, they had short stories. It's one thing to write a short story and then copy it over and over again, but when you write a novel, it takes hours to recopy it. But with the invention of the printing press, they could write up a novel and then typeset it and put out page after page. Now, I once heard that it took a writer, a monk, in the Middle Ages 8 months to copy a Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. 8 months. That needs to say Bibles were something only the very rich could afford, because you had to pay 8 months' wages to a person who had copied it. So only the church had them, and the kings had them, and a few very, very wealthy people in Europe had them, but most people didn't. Then came the invention of the printing press, and all of a sudden Bibles could just be stamped off of a page every few seconds. I mean, several pages, pardon me, every minute. And after a while, Bibles became something that could be produced in a matter of a few hours and sold at much, much lower prices. Again, the printing press was a device that should have propelled China to the top, enabled knowledge to be disseminated much, much cheaply. It didn't. Instead, Europeans took up the press and used it to propel themselves to the top. But China invented the novel, among other things, invented the printing press. They were great at poetry. Their novels oftentimes depicted a scene, well, again, typical of novels. They're just slightly removed from the world of reality. Based on the world of reality as you know it, but slightly removed. And I was reminded of that just over the weekend. I remember when I was a child reading a book about a famous cowboy named John Benjamin Kendrick. And I wanted to share my son. I thought, I'd better look up John Benjamin Kendrick online. I found out that this book I had read was what you call historical fiction, based on the life of the real John Benjamin Kendrick, but with a whole lot of fiction added in, and therefore was not reliable history. So I decided, well, no, I'll not share this with my son. You knew, and I've never heard of John Benjamin Kendrick. He wound up becoming governor of Wyoming, but he's in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Again, when I was a kid, cowboys was a big thing. All the movies on TV were cowboy movies. The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, Wagon Train, 26 Men, Jefferson Drum. Any of you ever heard of any of these shows? Past time. But all you'd watch in the evenings on TV was Westerns. Westerns where they get out their 6-shooter and shoot 15 shots without low reloading. They were called 6-shooters because they could only get 6 shots off. They would get to the gunfights and keep on bang, 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 and never reload, one after another. Anyway, so I was interested in cowboy life and read a book about one. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is they were based on some of the reality that was happening then, but nevertheless ever so slightly moved from that reality. All right. Then finally, your book your book raises the question, actually it does before, was why did the Chinese not develop technologically? Why did they not invent the automobile? Why did they not invent the airplane? Why did they not invent the radio, the telegraph, the telephone, when they were so far ahead of Europeans? And they were actually folk that were on the verge, just on the verge. I mean, the things they invented, the wheelbarrow, silk, porcelains, and you may not know, porcelain is used in electronics, it's used in capacitors. You have your porcelain capacitor, very important in electronics. Why did the Chinese not forge ahead? And your book says that maybe they emphasized too much government positions. A young man starting out, getting his education, was told, hey, to get ahead, you must get a government position. So he'd take a test, try to get a government position. And again, if you look at the biographies of individual Chinese, you'll find that they took these civil service exams to get the government position. There's too much emphasis. In other words, in our country, in America, if you don't want to be a government official, you can get to high up of becoming an engineer. You can become a, professional athlete. You can become a scientist. You can become a doctor. But there are all kinds of professions. In China, the only profession available to you to get ahead, forge ahead, was to become a government official. They looked down on the merchants as being inferior. I mean, the highest ideal was becoming a farmer. In contrast, Europeans somewhat came to look down on the farmer after a while. And I'll tell you something, having grown up in the country, when we played football against some of these schools in the big city, we were looked on as being these country boys, these farm boys, and like somehow being a farmer's son was not the ideal. And in America today, a lot of young men who are sons of farmers and do not want to take up their father's farm. And we don't know what are we going to do when all these older men retire and die off, and their sons don't take up the farms in their place. And folks, quite frankly, we don't know what we're going to do with the farming is almost out of, probably none of you plan to be a farmer, and I dare say that probably nobody at this school plans to go out of here and become a farmer. It's looked down on. Well, in China, farming was looked on as being the top profession, and manufacturing and entrepreneurship was looked on as being low in China, was looked down on. So they looked down on the merchants. That's another factor. But another, unlike most of the peoples of the world living at this time, China was actually united. You might say, wasn't that good? Maybe it wasn't. If you've studied American history, you know that American history went through a period where we built up monopolies. We built up an oil monopoly. We built up a steel monopoly. When the monopolies got control, they could put out all kinds of inferior products at high prices, and nothing could be done about it. Then except the United States government said we must bust up these trusts and force companies to become smaller companies and force competition. And it discouraged monopolies. Well, China was a government monopoly. If China had been divided into 50 different countries, one of them might have found what they called the way. The way of freedom, the way of democracy, the way of exploration, the way of science and technology, the way of inventiveness. As it was, Europe was divided into sometimes 200 and 300 different countries, speaking a couple hundred languages. And a couple of these countries found a way. Great Britain for one, to some extent France for another. They found a way. So China's unity held them back. Also, the Chinese philosophers emphasized morality more so than they did scientific advancement. In fact, a lot of the blame for China's lack of advancement doesn't go to the emperors, it goes to philosophers. Chinese emperors were much more likely to consult with philosophers than were European kings, with the result that the philosophers are said to have let them down by saying, all right, in the case of money, paper money and banking, the Chinese eventually destroyed all their paper money and closed all their banks, because one of their philosophers said this idea of banking and credit leads to greed. I mean, let's face it, folks, banks make their living by loaning out money and charging interest on the money they loan out. Well, a bunch of Chinese philosophers said this leads to greed, this leads to, money should not be used to create more money. We Westerners hardly could agree with them less, but this was their idea. So what was the result? Their money, their economy reached a certain point and then collapsed. One Chinese emperor, with the advice of his philosophers, closed all the banks. They allowed their ships to rot, closed down much of their factories, their steel melting places, their steel mills. Folks, steel mills is one thing that made this country so great. We started using structural steel to build our bridges, to build our battleships, to build our merchant ships, to build our automobiles. Steel. My dad worked in steel for a while, so did my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather worked as steel workers in the area around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the country. And there in Middletown, Ohio, there's still a large steel mill. Armco Steel produces a lot of steel. Chinese had steel mills also. They closed them down. Leads to greed, leads to corruption. We don't need that stuff. So, essentially, folk, it appears that what destroyed the Chinese in the long run was the philosophers. They devoted themselves to helping the poor, particularly the Sung dynasty, which sounds like a noble thing to do. What's wrong with it? Or the same thing that's always wrong with socialism. It destroys incentive. Hey, I'm going to be taken care of anyway, whether I work or not. I'm speaking as a man living under communism might speak. So why should I toil and labor and get all wet and sweaty when I'm going to get fed whether I produce or not? Helping the poor sounds like a great and noble thing to do. All right.